Good to be with you. Weather's changing. It's getting colder. And we're getting toward the end of this book. I got a few ideas about what we might do for the next class. I generally kind of alternate between a book of the Bible. We just finished Ezekiel. And then we try to do something that is kind of cultural but spiritually relevant, hence this particular book. It's not explicitly Christian per se, and then something that might have to deal with the history of the church or the history of Israel, so something like that. So I've got a few ideas. Might just try to bite off the book of Romans. I haven't done, that would be a lot of fun. That's not a small book. But we're coming toward the end here, and I want to say a word before we get into this particular lesson. Pages 108 to 122. The meaning of life. So you've wondered, and here it is for you. Now it's all been settled. The meaning of life. The early Christian movement really was Jewish, if you think about it. Jesus was a Jew, the early apostles were Jews, but then as it spread to the Greco-Roman world, the whole Christian outlook increasingly got shaped within that way of thinking, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I teach at a classical school. We talk about Plato and Aristotle and all of that. Aristotle has a particular philosophy called particular part of his philosophy called the categories, which he believes are the fundamental bases upon which to think about everything. And it's like space, time, matter, and there's about 10 of them. But beginning in the 19th and 20th centuries, but before then, actually, but particularly, a number of thinkers that are come to be known as existentialists began to argue that this is not the right way of looking at things, because it's not that it's... Even if you have a philosopher or a scientist or a historian who is so intelligent, who is so knowledgeable that he grasps practically everything, he's still an individual existing person. And so everything that he thinks is going to be premised on his own individual existence. Even if he has a theory of the universe that seems to account for everything, Søren Kierkegaard in one of his books complains about philosophers who explain everything except their own selves. In other words, the fundamental categories that we have to deal with at a philosophical level will be the categories of individual human life, because all our theories about reality, all of our ideas about reality come from people. They come from people. And so those need to be the fundamental categories. And I mention that up front because Viktor Frankl calls himself and uses the term throughout the book of existentialism. And it's not always clear to people what that means. Existentialism basically means that it's a philosophy. And it means that the fundamental categories with which we have to deal are the categories of the individual human person. And whatever theories we might make, whether they're scientific or historical or philosophical or religious, eventually there's someone back of them. Someone came up with these ideas, and it's going to be an individual person. And so Viktor Frankl then wants to argue, as many other existentialists have argued, that the fundamental question in life has to do with the meaning and the purpose of the individual human existence. And anything else that they want to say about science or history or these other wonderful subjects is going to have to come back to that. So I mention that because in this particular lesson he gets to the meaning of life. Let's see if there's any questions about that or comments about that. Ben.
Like Alice, what is it, the movie, no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, Wizard of Oz. Yeah, Wizard of Oz. And not all existentialist philosophers are Christians. Some of them are, some of them are not, but they would all generally agree that the fundamental questions, the ground level questions that we have to deal with, are questions about individual people and what the purpose and meaning of their life is. So that's where Frankl picks up on page 108 in this book. And he kind of opens with this observation this is page 20 of my lesson here. More and more, a psychiatrist is approached today by patients who confront him with human problems rather than neurotic symptoms. In Freud's day, a lot of people had mental health issues, and they came to psychiatrists for that, but increasingly, I have Joe Lilly right here, right now, he might be able to corroborate, they come with ordinary human problems. Some of the people who nowadays call on a psychiatrist would have seen a pastor, priest, or a rabbi in former days. Now they often refuse to be handed over to a clergyman and instead confront the doctor with questions such as, what is the meaning of my life? So he's wrestling with this issue that, he gets patients who, they're not technically sick, but they come into the office asking for answers to questions that in times past they would have turned to a rabbi or a pastor or someone like that to answer. Now, I do mention here in the front end, Viktor Frankl is skeptical about whether we can come up with a generic definition of the meaning of life. And I don't really think that that's correct. We can do that. I mention here in the notes, if we go to the Westminster Catechism, which is about 500 years old, somewhere in that ballpark, man's chief end or purpose is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. How many have heard that before? Okay. So that's not hard. You can come up with a statement about the purpose of human life. But you understand Frankl's resistance to that, because even if you were to say that, even if you were to know that, what's more important, of course, is that you are living that out and that you are discovering that for yourself. C.S. Lewis wrestles with this a little bit at the beginning. I think it's in the preface of the Introduction to Mere Christianity, where he says, what is a Christian? Technically, a Christian is a person who believes that God has become incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ. But we all know people who will say that, but don't necessarily live that out. And Lewis wrestles with that kind of briefly at the beginning, and he says, well, that's probably correct. But practically speaking, it's just useful to keep the word Christian for people who believe X. So he goes with the direction of what's useful to say. And that's probably what's going on with Frankl here. You can come up with a general definition of the meaning of human life. But for most people, that doesn't really do anything for them because they have to discover it for themselves. Even if you can tell a patient, or if you're talking with a neighbor, or maybe a young person or somebody who you're trying to open doors to them spiritually, giving them a technical definition of the meaning of life probably isn't going to be very helpful to them, because it's sort of like learning math. You have to do the work yourself before it does you any good. Anybody ever had math teachers who said you have to show your work? Of course. Anybody can look at the back of the book and find the answers. But have they really learned anything? No, they haven't gone through the processes of learning. And so even though they get an A, even though they get the answer correct, there's something cognitively that hasn't happened there. And that's true of spiritual life too. That's why always raising If you raise your children as Christians, maybe you've discovered that's a tricky business because they might learn the answers by rote, but they need to learn it for themselves. And so there's the old joke, the Sunday school teacher's talking to the kids and says, well, what sits on a lily pad and is green and goes ribbit, ribbit? The kid raises his hand and he says, well, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sounds an awful lot like a frog to me. So it's just, you're raising your kids within this atmosphere where they kind of know the answers, but they're not thinking about the questions, and so that's always tough. So we'll see if there's any questions about that, but the issue is, can you come up with a general answer to the question, what's the meaning of human life? Sure. But will it do anybody any good? Yeah, I think that's what Frankl's asking. Yeah. Will it do anybody any good? Now he gets, I've got a few quotes here on page 20. The meaning of life differs from man to man, day to day, hour to hour. What matters is not the meaning of life in general, so a general definition, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. Meaning of life always changes, but never ceases to be. And that's his way of saying, well, yeah, you can probably provide a general answer to the question, but anybody who's a Christian knows, too, that if I say my chief end is to glorify God, okay. What does that mean for me today? What does that mean for me in my present situation? That's always changing. And it's not because God changes, but it is because we change. If I drive down the road, the scenery is always changing. But it's not really the scenery that's changing, it's me that's changing my position relative to the scenery. And so it looks like everything's changing. The world around me is just kind of sitting there. But I'm changing my position. And in many ways, our relationship with the Lord is like that. We are always changing. And so his call to us comes to us in fresh, new ways constantly. But that isn't because he changes, but it's because we are changeable creatures, and our position is different. And sometimes as Christians, we lose sight of that. He's not talking specifically to Christians, but he's talking as a psychologist. How can he work with certain patients with this logotherapy and help them ask the question, what am I doing with my life? What's the purpose? What's the point? What am I headed toward? And typically, when you deal with young people or even older people, what are the purposes of life that people generally give, if they give one at all? Be happy, which is a blank check for anything. I want to be happy. And then, you get to specific things. What leads to happiness? Maybe money, girls or boys, some kind of relationship with the opposite sex. That's supposed to fix the problem. Good luck with that.
I had a suitcase and it was like, good luck. I got out of high school.
You did have a suitcase?
That's what my graduation gift was, a suitcase. It was like, goodbye, figure it out.
Did they write good luck on the suitcase?
No.
I might try that, though. That's interesting.
That was my graduation gift, too. I got a suitcase for graduation.
Oh, here's your hat. What's your hurry?
So we got together and had two suitcases.
Well, everybody wants to be happy, And so there's that. And when we're younger, the ideas of what will make us happy are childish. They're really, really childish. I use when I was really young, I can remember having a certain toy that I wanted for Christmas. And I just thought, I had visions, I had imaginations, I had dreams. Anybody remember dreaming about a toy that you ever wanted? No. Yes. Ish. Okay. The way it was when I got this toy, I just felt solid that my life would be complete. It was very hard to think of anything that could be higher than getting that toy. I would just have pictures of playing with it, and just eternity just spread itself out in front of me, and it was like, this is it. And I must have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 years old in my pea-brained mentality, thinking that I had hit upon something here. And I got it. So it was like the movie The Christmas Story, I got what I wanted. And I can tell you, it was nice. But it didn't satisfy. It was like, well, this is the end of...
What was it? I'm curious.
It was that, Star Wars was all the rage, and it was that Snow Walker, that AT-AT, and you and Dad said you would never get it for me because it was too expensive. It was like almost $50, which there was a time when that was considered a lot of money. And no, I didn't see it there under the tree or anything like that, and I said, this is the end, But I got it.
Still in the closet.
I played with it a lot, but it did not become the apex of my existence. That is true.
All this discussion reminds me of a poem that Viktor E Frankl wrote when he was in prison. I don't know the whole poem, but it starts with the question, who am I? Am I one thing today and tomorrow another?
Yes.
And he goes through a number of things, and then he concludes, they haunt me, these lonely questions of mine. That's the last line in the poem. That's all I can remember, but it's very much this kind of discussion about this reflective thinking about yourself and who you are. What do you mean?
Yeah.
He's in prison because of his opposition to the Third Reich, but he would shortly be hung. So,
Well, I think when Bonhoeffer wrote that poem, some of you may have read it. He knew that his day of his hanging was approaching, that they were going to kill him. And he was looking back over the things that he had done. His future, of course, was now cut short. So you do have to ask yourself, what was it all for? What do I have to look forward to? It's a powerful poem. So all people, according to Frankl, ask this question about the meaning and the purpose of human life. And we have different things at different stages in our life that strike us as what's worthwhile to pursue. If I mentioned kind of a humorous thing a moment ago, for a child, it could be a toy. For a young man or woman hitting puberty, it's probably going to be a member of the opposite sex. If you think that's going to make you happy, well, you'll learn. That's got a lot of good stuff going on there, but it's going to bring as much trouble as it brings happiness. It's because there's another person. There's another human person. They've got desires and goals and ends of their own, right? They're not just there for you. And of course, Christians have always taught that God alone is the ultimate source of peace and happiness in the present life. So Frankl, though, raises this question, though, because he believes that many people struggle through life for failing to ask this fundamental question. Part of logotherapy is getting them to ask themselves this question. What are you striving for? What is important to you? What are your values? What is the meaning of life? And his job as a psychologist is not to furnish them with the answers, but like a good teacher, to help them arrive at the answer for themselves so that it does them some good. So he says, ultimately, man should not ask what is the meaning of his life, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. Each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. So he has to answer that question. And then in the next section, he entitles this, in his book, The Essence of Existence. Top of page 21. I'll read some of these quotes. I think he's in a private argument here with Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, but he doesn't name him per se. The emphasis on responsibility is reflected in the categorical imperative of logotherapy. Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first as wrongly as you are about to act now. Well, that's a very interesting idea. And he says what he means by it. This invites the individual to imagine that the present is the past. And second, the past may yet be changed and amended. Such a precept confronts man with life's finiteness as well as the finality of what he makes out of both his life and himself. So here he's talking about strategies for getting people to think about their life. Imagine that you take your present life, and then imagine that you're looking back on it from a later day. If there's something you could change about it, what would it be? And I think that stokes in a lot of people some ideas. Usually, this only, in my experience, happens to people when they get cancer or they get sick or they know they've only got a couple weeks to live. All of a sudden, everything becomes clear, and they know what they want to change. If you had asked them a week before, they wouldn't have known. But now that time is running out, they say, oh, I got to get things right with this person. I got to do this thing over here. I got to do that thing over there. And life becomes very, very focused for them. So in some ways, what Frankl is doing is asking them, is putting them in that situation. Logotherapy tries to make the patient fully aware of his own responsibility. In other words, we have free choices. We're responsible for the choices that we make. We can't push that off on other people. It's not the fault of society. It's not the fault of our parents. It's not the fault of the white man or the black man or the Asian man. It's not some other racial group. It's not the fault of men. It's not the fault of women. I have to choose what my attitude will be. And so a logotherapist is least tempted of all psychotherapists to impose value judgments on his patients. He will never permit the patient to pass to the doctor the responsibility for judging. What do you think I should do? At that point, the therapist says, well, that's not my job to tell you. What do you think you should do? It is neither teaching nor preaching. It is as far removed from logical reasoning as it is from moral exhortation. The logotherapist's role consists of widening and broadening the visual field of the patient so that the whole spectrum of potential meaning becomes conscious and visible to him. Now, he works his way from here toward some definite ideas, but I think you can see what he's getting at. We all have had conversations with people in which you realize the freedom and responsibility of the person that you're talking to. And you can't decide for them. You can exhort them. You can threaten them with dire consequences if they go down a certain road. But in the end, it's really up to them. They have to decide. And, you know, if you counsel young people or children or older people, you see them go down a road that you don't think is the right road, there's not much you can do for them. Though people do realize perhaps later in life, after the consequences of their decisions have come in, that they made an oopsie. You know, and that's everybody's right. But so here, Frankl's talking more as a psychologist. How does he enter into that with his patients? I'm sure you've had conversations with people who were dead set on a course of action you knew was wrong. You want to raise a hand to that? But what could you do? You can't stop them. And maybe you yourself reached a point in your life where you were at the tail end of a course of action you yourself pursued. And you looked at your life and thought, oh, I guess this wasn't the best. Anybody ever been there? Yes, well, we've all been there in some capacity. I don't know. You talk with people in prison. Do you ever get those kinds of conversations?
The thing that's simple about going into prison is they already know that they've been on the wrong path. I mean, it's blatantly obvious. So,
You don't have to reason them out of it. They're there.
And that, I find, when you try and minister to somebody that's not in prison, they have all their, I got all the answer. You know, it breaks down a lot of, they see a need for a different course of action. Whereas folks that are just, you run into on the street, don't see a need for a different course of action. Or a different path. They don't see that.
Yeah. So there's a difference between talking to a teenager who's not in prison and a 30-year-old man who is. They look at life from a different perspective.
Teenagers got everything figured out.
Yeah.
They're good.
Well, they've seen a lot of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's sarcasm. It is funny how your confidence in your own course of action is so powerful when you're young, right? And then as you get older, you question it more.
That last, I think it's the next paragraph.
On self-transcendence? Or which one do you think?
Yeah, no, that's when my life changed. When I started figuring out that I need to be living for something else, something outside of me, someone, something, that's when things changed.
Yeah.
Because up till that point, I was living for me. And it was all I was trying to get, what was best for me. The irony in that is that by serving someone else, that is what's best for me. It's kind of
Yeah, Joe Lilly's not here today, but he does therapy with people, and sometimes he's been frustrated because as a Christian, he feels that there are certain things that he wants to share with his clients, which he probably could on a personal basis, but he couldn't do it, say, while he's wearing his psychologist hat. And Frankl's wrestling with that too in this book, because he says on the one hand, well, you know, I don't preach and I don't do this, that, and the next thing, But as you move through the book, he definitely moves in a particular direction that he thinks is right for people. And so here, in this last paragraph in the section, page 21, the true meaning of life, which he's just said moments ago cannot really be defined, he's now about to say something about it, he couldn't help it, is self-transcendence. But he defines it in a broad way. The fact of being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is, the more he actualizes himself. Self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Now, he's using a lot of psychobabble there, but I think he's saying exactly what you did. You learn to forget about yourself and pursue something greater and bigger than yourself. And that is, in a broad sense, what the meaning of life is. And of course, that, I think he realizes that when he's writing it, plays right into the religious outlook, because there's nothing more transcendent than God. There's no concept in the human language or mind that is more beyond than God. And so if self-transcendence is the very essence of the meaning of human life, then it's going to eventually lead in some kind of a religious direction. Because this life is finite. We are finite, and the relationships and the things that we pursue are finite. But we find little areas in life where this is true. You know, happiness is never arrived at by aiming at it. It's arrived at by aiming at some other thing, and then happiness occurs as a side effect of that. But the people who decide, well, I'm going to make myself happy, kind of hamstring themselves right on the front end right there. Because that's not how it comes. It's sort of like trying to get yourself to fall asleep by focusing on it. Well, you know how that works. I'm going to fall asleep and work real hard at it. Well, there are those things in life that you can only accomplish by forgetting about them and by pursuing some other thing. And that's a trivial example, but it's an easy example to show that, yeah, there's these areas in life where you succeed at something by setting that thing aside and by pursuing something else, like your homework. Before you know it, you're asleep. That's just for the kids right there. Nothing helps you fall asleep more quickly than attending to your homework. Or reading. You can't fall asleep, you can't fall asleep, you can't fall asleep. Well, I guess I'm awake, so you pick up a book and you start reading. Before you know it, you're asleep. You have to leave it aside. And I think that's what he's getting at here. Well, I'll see if there's any questions. He's got a couple methods that he uses. And I know that none of us here are like professional psychologists, per se. But we do have relationships with other people. Children or our friends or our neighbors or other people where we try to we try to share with them the spiritual life that is in us, and so to that extent these things can be helpful. In our own culture, people can be very put off by religious talk. They're offended by it, or they're put off by it, or the defense mechanisms just kind of come up. And so that's the end of the conversation, right? Or positive hostility, And right now in our culture, since Christianity is thought of so much in terms of politics, and people are very passionate about politics, that if you try to talk with someone about religion, they may think you're trying to have a political discussion with them. It doesn't have anything to do with politics, but that's the assumption. And so we might ask, well, how can we share our faith with people who have so many defense mechanisms and are so easily offended. And yet we feel for those people. We see that they do need a meaning and a purpose and a direction in their life. And how can we open those doors, to where that conversation's even possible? I did not design this class in preparation for the holidays. But the holidays are always when the family gets together, and the conversations come up from time to time. So anyways. He says here, we can discover the meaning of life in 3 ways. At least 3 that he wants to mention. Creating a work or doing a deed. Okay, so you find something to do. 2, experiencing something or encountering someone. And 3, by the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. And there he comes back to his experience in the concentration camp. Because, of course, that's the least obvious. For most people, it's hard to see how, if you're in a camp with no food and you're being abused and it looks like you're going to die, how do you find meaning and purpose in that? So he saves that one till last. But the first approach, the way of achievement or accomplishment, is obvious. And I think he's right. That's the simplest thing. Some people like him, some don't. But Jordan Peterson's a well-known Canadian psychologist. He's always in the news and on podcasts and things, and he has these lists of things. But he tells young men and women to make their bed and clean their room. And it seems trivial. But in a way, it's sort of a ground level of start here. You wake up in the morning, get out of bed, make your bed, clean your room. And you'd be surprised how many people say, this changed my life. It's so simple. And then you get people, there's thousands of testimonials about how this just revolutionized their whole life. For the first time in my life, I got dressed and cleaned my room. And on the one hand, it's funny because you're like, is that where we're at? Is a society? That this is the wisdom of the day. And yet, for a lot of people, it's like, no, this helped me.
If you're a parent, it can change your parents' life.
Well, he gets credit for starting at the ground level. Do something. Get a job. Create a new relationship. Clean your room. Build something. But do some finite task. And there's that transcendence. Outside yourself. Get out of your head and do something. Second, though, the second way of finding a meaning in life is by experiencing something, and especially another human being in his very uniqueness by loving him. And Frankl comes back to the idea of love quite a bit. Loving other people. Love is a primary phenomenon. Now, here he's arguing with Freud. Because Freud often portrays love as a kind of, that love isn't really real, that it's just animal drives out of which we build a concept of love. And Frankl just contradicts him at this point and says, no, love is a real thing. Sex can be a mode of expression for love, but sex is only justified and sanctified as long as it is a vehicle for love. So there he's in an argument with Freud, and I don't know that this has as much pull right now as it did in his own time. But Freud certainly thought that sex was basically an animal drive that we dress up to look like something much bigger than it is. And I think Frankl wants to say, no. Love is a real thing, and it's even more primary than sex is. There are many different kinds of love. Love of a parent for a child, or a child for a parent, or a friend for a friend, or a husband for a spouse. And all of these are very, very real. Human sexuality can be a way of expressing that, but these things aren't just fictions. And he says love is the only way to grasp, there's a typo, gasp, another human being in the innermost core of his personality. By love, you are enabled to see the essential traits and features of the beloved. And even more, you are able to see that which is potential in the beloved, that which is not yet actualized, but ought to be actualized. And you can even enable the beloved person to actualize these potentialities. So when we truly love another person, we help them, we try to help them become the best that they can be. And so that's not like, I need you to do all of these things for me. But that is, I want you to be the best human person that you can be, and I'm here to help you do that. And you can do that. For a lot of people, they only realize it with their children, because in marriage, men and women need each other in various capacities. And so,
Was it C.S. Lewis that he said he had, like, it may not be C.S. Lewis, but the premise was that he had 3 friends, and one of them either passed away or went away, and he was looking forward to getting to know his other friend that wasn't leaving, and he realized that he actually knew him less after the one person left, because that one person brought out things from that, his friends, that he didn't bring out himself. So he actually found out that he knew him less. He didn't know.
I think that was C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, I think that was.
I don't know why this reminded me of that.
I think that's C.S. Lewis, because he might mention that in the 4 Loves. He talks a lot about the subject in that particular book. If you haven't read the 4 Loves by C.S. Lewis, it's an incredibly insightful book. And one of the things he does mention it, when men and women get together, they have things that they need from one another. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's entirely natural. But a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, it's not until the birth of some little monkey, who has a whole hat full of needs and nothing to give. They're just a bundle of need, that the father and the mother suddenly learn what it means to love another person, to want what is best for them, to support them, to create the best possible life for them, with zero expectation of return, because the kid doesn't have a whole lot that they can give. And so a family can become a school of love in that sense. And so there's a lot of different ways in which people use the word love. And so we might say, well, there's lower loves and then higher loves, rather than just say, well, this is love and this isn't love. But at the highest level, you're increasingly giving without expectation of return. And nothing trains you in that more than raising kids. Kids definitely do it. He uses this language of enabling a person to become the best that they can be, to actualize their potential, and wanting that for another person. So that's powerful. I mean, from a Christian point of view, that's what God does with us. He wants us to be the best that we can possibly be. And He gives His whole life for that. And we don't really give Him all that much in return. Not too much. And he doesn't need it. It's not like God needs us. He loves us in a very charitable, gift-giving kind of way. But I'll say this and see if there's any comment, but I once had a Sunday school teacher tell me, I was always asking questions. I was that kid, pain to have in the class. Why did God create us? Now, what's the point? Sunday school teachers love having kids like me in the class, I can tell you. It goes right off the lesson. And they said, well, because he was lonely and he needs someone to keep him company. Now, I think that that's a terrible answer. But at the time, I just remember as a kid thinking, I just didn't think I was very good company. And I thought, well, God wanted company. He could probably come up with a better solution than me, But it was a well-meant answer. But you can probably all see that was unworthy of God. The teacher meant well, but that was not worthy of God. God is far grander than that. To need to create little bits and pieces of company to save him from his loneliness. What a silly answer.
There's a speckle of truth in it.
Well, talk about it. There might be, yeah.
I think God wants a relationship with each one of us. So
Yes.
not that he's lonely, but that he wants to see what we'll do with what he's given us.
Well, and that might have been it. He does desire relationship with us. But he doesn't desire it out of his need. He has no needs. He is complete. What's that? Yeah, she put the lesson together the night before. We had the cookies and the craft and everything. She wasn't prepared for
The meaning of life.
Yeah, there's, like I said, there's always that kid who's like, look, they just asked me to teach the class. Why do you ask me all these questions? So that's always kind of the funny thing about church, Sunday school classes and things. We pull them together and, But there's something in finding the meaning of life. The first thing he talks about is doing something, an achievement or a goal. But the second thing is a relationship. Use the word relationship. There's a reciprocity there in entering into a personal relationship. And we do things for one another in relationship. But in some ways, the relationship itself becomes the main issue and not the give and the take that we exchange in those relationships. So you could say that Viktor Frankl is arguing that the highest purpose of life is relationship, personal relationship. And that's true even on Christian grounds. It's not relationship with another human, but it's relationship with the Lord. And so he's, in his own way, zeroing in on that, even though earlier he doesn't want to take a definite position on the question. And then he says, bottom page 21, the third way of finding meaning in life is by suffering. We must never forget that we can also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate cannot be changed. What matters then is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change our own selves. So I'm going to read a little passage from 1:12 to 1:13. He's got a few areas here where he gives a few examples of situations where he dealt with a patient. This is one of them. Bottom of page 112. Let me cite a clear-cut example. Once, an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering. To be sure, the price that you now have to survive and mourn her. He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. So he helped the individual to see his own suffering as a kind of sacrifice in relation to that other person. So I thought that was a powerful example. He offers another on page 114 to 115. Some of these are just, he's talking in theory about logotherapy and meeting patients and talking about the meaning of life, but of course, concretely, specifically, what does that look like in actual practice? Page 114, last paragraph. Let me recall that which was perhaps the deepest experience I had in the concentration camp. The odds of surviving the camp were no more than 1 in 28, as can easily be verified by exact statistics. It did not even seem possible, let alone probable, that the manuscript of my first book, which I had hidden in my coat when I arrived at Auschwitz, would ever be rescued. Thus I had to overcome the loss of my mental child. So here he's got a work he's produced, but it looks like it'll be lost. Now it seemed as if nothing and no one would survive me, neither a physical nor a mental child of my own. So I found myself confronted with the question of whether under such circumstances my life was ultimately void of any meaning. Not yet did I notice that an answer to this question with which I was wrestling so passionately was already in store for me, and that soon thereafter this answer would be given to me. This was the case when I had to surrender my clothes and in turn inherited the worn-out rags of an inmate who had already been sent to the gas chamber immediately after his arrival at Auschwitz railway station. Instead of the many pages of my manuscript, I found in a pocket of the newly acquired coat one single page torn out of a Hebrew prayer book containing the most important Jewish prayer, Shema Israel. That is from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, mind, and strength. So he found that tucked into this individual's clothes. How should I have interpreted such a coincidence other than as a challenge to live my thoughts instead of merely putting them on paper? A bit later, I remember it seemed to me that I would die in the near future. In this critical situation, however, my concern was different from that of most of my comrades. Their question was, will we survive the camp? For if not, all this suffering has no meaning. The question which beset me was, has all this suffering, this dying around us, a meaning? For if not, then ultimately there is no meaning to survival. For a life whose meaning depends upon such a happenstance as whether one escapes or not, ultimately would not be worth living at all. So there he talks a little bit about what he said in some other places. to find meaning in the present situation regardless of what the possible outcome might be. And the fact that that little prayer was tucked in his clothes, he only mentions here in this particular passage, but it's a powerful little note.
Doesn't suffering help us to help other people that are suffering and other getting through it too? Kind of like he does.
That's one way to do it.
It brings meaning to it takes the suffering and turns it for something good. A purpose to it. And a lot of people won't listen to you if you haven't gone through what they've gone through.
Yeah.
They're just like, they don't, they have a wall up to where you don't understand me, you don't understand where I've been, you don't, and so it's harder to break through to them and talk to them. Whereas if you've been where they've been, if you've been through what they've been through, they tend to, it breaks down walls to where they'll.
So you can repurpose your difficulty. Yeah, people will say, well, if you visit someone in prison, they say, well, you haven't been where I've been. And then if you turn around and say, well, I have been, actually, they might listen. And that's sometimes people who talk about people addicted to drugs are themselves people who struggled with drug addiction, right? So people say, well, you don't know what it's like to be addicted to drugs. And then someone says, I do, actually. And I'm here to tell you some things that I went through. And so one of the ways, is to repurpose our suffering and difficulty and turn it into a way of identifying with other people.
Or like him and this guy lost his spouse.
Yeah.
Michael went through the same thing and he didn't mention that.
He didn't mention it, but he'd certainly lost his spouse.
So he understood and maybe that other thing.
Yeah. Or people who make poor decisions in life can share those with other people. Say, I made the same poor decisions, and I can tell you how that impacted me. C.S. Lewis, when he writes Mere Christianity, everybody talks about what a great apologist he is and everything. But in truth, if you look at his life, he was an atheist for most of his life. And sort of like St. Augustine, he almost like tried every philosophy and worldview there was before he became a Christian. And in some ways, that became his legacy. And he actually mentions in one of his books, everybody thinks I'm so smart. And he says, I'm not. I'm stupid. He said, the issue with me is that I had to go through every stupid answer before I could arrive at the correct one. And now I can actually talk to people about it. But most people, unlike him, didn't really have to sort of walk through all of those different ways of looking at the world. But he did. He just had to go through it. And so that's how he viewed himself. He was a kind of apostle to intellectually inclined people who just couldn't seem to hit the right answer until they had done every wrong answer. And it was a rather humble way of looking at it, Now, in the end, he turned out to be a pretty smart guy because he had gone through all that journey. But he had to do that. And that's true of all of us. We have some area in our life where we fail or where we struggle or where we go through difficulties that we look back and think, oh, geez, I really didn't need to go through all of that. But that can be repurposed, and that can be a way of talking to people. Well, we're past time. At the end here, we'll got maybe 1 or 2 weeks of this book left before we're done. He's going to talk about life's transitoriness and also on what he calls super meaning. So I haven't got time to hit that today, but of course, the big questions are, what do you do with death? And what do you do with the fact of whether there's anything beyond death? And he has to bite that off because as a psychologist, he's dealing with people who are going to face death. And death for most people looks like the end. It just looks like, well, that's the end of all meaning and purpose in life. And so one has to address that. So if you haven't read those sections yet, I won't be able to jump into them today, but read the sections on super meaning and life's transitoriness, because that's where he hits, I think, the big religious question: death, and is there anything beyond? I'll let you go. Thank you very much.